Okay, guys, English Literature Paper 2 is next Tuesday. And this paper is 2 hours and 15 minutes. You have three sections. Section A, which is modern prose or drama. Section B, which is your poetry anthology. And Section C, which is unseen poetry. Today, we're going to look at modern prose or drama and Inspector Calls. So this is worth 34 marks. So I would still recommend around 45 minutes, ideally a little bit less, so you can have a little bit of time to check your work and make sure it's accurate. But you'll have two choices of questions and just go for the one that you feel more comfortable with, what you've memorized more quotes for and more analysis for. And really, you can make every question work for you. You don't need to memorize every single quote. It's more about quality of analysis over the quantity. But in this case, if I'm looking here, I will go for the first one. How does Priestley present what life is like for women in an Inspector Calls? So you don't need to plan in this really excessive way, but I think a brief plan so you know how you're going to cover beginning, middle, and end. So either whether it's the quotes that you're going to use, um, whatever it is, but make sure you cover beginning, middle, and end of the play. That way you're going to meet AO1 very well. And I would say about two quotes per paragraph. Again, you might not remember it all when you're planning, it might come to you later, but for the case now, I will think of two references per paragraph and try and think of a range of techniques. I'm covering AO2 as well as the context AO3. So at the start, the way women are presented, I will start off with Sheila and the way that she says, "Yes, go on, mummy." Very infantilized, very immature, seems to be like this subservient woman who's not even an adult, even though she's in her 20s. Also, the way that Sybil tells her off for wanting to know what Gerald was up to that summer. And she says, you'll have to get used to that. You have to get used to accepting that men will do what they want and they're going to be working most of the time. And you're not going to be able to question that or really have a say. So you have to accept that. And also a bit later on, when Gerald also tries to shield Sheila from the information of what he did, he actively says, "Oh, you don't want to hear this. It's bound to be unpleasant," suggesting that, women, they can't handle it. So that's my first paragraph. That's towards the beginning. Now, as the play develops, we can see that women, especially through Eva Smith, um, they get treated very badly. So we know that Eric says she was pretty and a good sport. However, later he says, I was in that state when a chap turns nasty. Basically, sexual assault. He was drunk. And the inspector calls that out and says that he used her as if she was an animal, a thing. So that's towards the middle, but we need to cover the end of the text as well. So I'm going to think at how Sheila at the end, she provides a sense that women will not be confined to these roles, that they can be more independent and more influential in society. So how she says to Gerald, I need time to think. She doesn't want to just accept the marriage anymore. The societal pressure to get married for women and all of that. She wants to think about this. And she even calls out her parents, saying, you don't seem to have learned anything. So, if anything, she becomes their kind of moral guidance and the person who's criticizing as if she's a parent now. She has the moral high ground. So, we've covered beginning, middle, and end. Now, with an introduction, you want to have a thesis or a main approach to the question. So really what that means is you're going to cover the main points about that question, about life for women, and have an overall view of life for women in an Inspector Calls. And then you can link it to Priestley's message about life for women and link it to some context, some historical context. So I'll show you what I mean. We can say in an Inspector Calls, the seminal 1945 didactic play. Didactic just means it's designed to teach something, and seminal means like groundbreaking. It's still very influential and important. We can say Priestley presents the life of women in complex ways, depending on class and age. The lives of upper class women such as Sheila and Sybil, are initially presented as restricted due to traditional patriarchal gender roles. And Eva Smith, or working class women like Eva Smith, are depicted as vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. However, so that was my first two paragraphs, the limits, the restriction, and also the exploitation. However, Priestley hints at the potential for women's independence and increasing role in society, reflecting, now this is the context. What is it reflecting? Well, it's reflecting in the society there was growing freedom for women, especially post-war, due to the way they contributed to the war and also the increasing political role of women after the suffragettes. So we can just touch on that, reflecting evolving gender roles and growing freedom for women in post-war British society. Actually, it doesn't need to be capital there. So that's my introduction there. We've given our overall view on the question on lives for women. We've touched on the whole text, the whole play, and we linked it to Priestley's message about that and some context to help us explain that. So now my first paragraph, I'm just going to structure it early on. We can say, and let me say about paragraphs, I would say you have a clear point, signposting what the paragraph is about and where it is, where, like, what part of the play it is. Then give two or more references so you can really develop and prove your point and develop your analysis. Don't repeat yourself. Explain, for example, you can explain how you view the quote, how you interpret it. You could explain the effects on the reader or audience. You could link it to themes, and you could zoom in on different words and techniques. So we got some sentence stems I might use. We can talk about the initial reading, like what does the technique highlight or show about the character? Can I zoom in on a phrase, a word, a verb, or a technique? Maybe it's even structural things like juxtaposition or foreshadowing. Can I link to the themes and big ideas such as social injustice or generational divide and things like that? And can I talk about the reader's response, how the emotions they might feel or how they might view characters, and even alternative interpretations? And if you can just vary this and not repeat it, you will build a very strong answer. So let's have a look at here. Let's do the first one about early on in the play. So I'm going to say early on, women are presented as being forced into subservient and passive roles in the family. Sheila, an adult woman, seems to be stunted emotionally, frequently saying, "Yes, go on, mummy." Now, the technique of that, we could say this use of infantilized language is like she's an infant, a child, highlights the immaturity and childish nature of Sheila's character at this stage, in that she still views herself as beneath adulthood despite being in her 20s, highly dependent on her parents and soon to be dependent on Gerald as her husband. Now, I think I could bring in more of Priestley's intentions or the context here, actually more about the historical context. This may be due to her upper class family shielding her from the realities of the harsh classist society in Edwardian Britain, or simply due to the fact that women were not expected or allowed to function as equal adults in a patriarchal society. So they're reduced to these like childish kind of characters. Now I'm going to link it to the next quote about "you'll get used to that." So we could say, moreover, Moreover, she is reprimanded for challenging this childish role and wanting to have more insight into her fiance's life, as her mother says she will have to get used to that. Essentially, being confined to the domestic sphere, just as she did. So what's Priestley saying here? I mean, he's showing that even women like Sybil, really privileged women, are kind of imposing these limitations on women as well. So we could say here, Priestley is reflecting the acceptance of women's subservience, even from Sybil, a highly privileged and aristocratic woman of a vastly superior social class to the majority. He powerfully shows how these restrictive patriarchal roles are imposed even by upper class women onto the next generation. Now we're going to go on to what Gerald said. As the play develops and Gerald's immoral actions are about to be exposed, he attempts to hide this from Sheila, saying it's bound to be unpleasant. This is actually patronizing language. This patronizing language reflects reflects the view that women, as the fairer sex, cannot handle uncomfortable truths, as they may bring emotional pain, even if it concerns their husband's affairs. Now, I'm going to explicitly link to the context. As such, Priestley is criticizing, Priestley's big idea, his message, and the wider context. Priestley is critiquing the misogynistic views, the misogynistic double standards for men and women, where women were expected to be unquestioning and subservient, whilst men would transgress marriages without any repercussions. So we've covered early on. Now let's do the same and look at the play as it develops. As the play progresses, Priestley exposes how, and this one is more about the objectification and the exploitation of women, exposes how women are objectified in Edwardian Britain, and vulnerable to exploitation. So when Eric recalls his relationship with Eva, he initially states she was pretty and a good sport. So the use of the adjective pretty highlights his emphasis on her superficial looks and attractiveness as determinant of a woman's value. Moreover, the use of colloquial language referring to her as a good sport highlights or suggests that he views her passivity and non-resistance to his advances as part of her appeal as a woman. This reflects wider misogynistic views of objectification towards women, and a sense that men had control over women's bodies, which evidently opened the door to abuse. Indeed, Eric acknowledges that he did sexually exploit her, but dismisses it as simply being in a state when a chap turns nasty. So that's almost like euphemism. When you refer to something serious in a way that doesn't sound that bad, turns nasty. So this euphemistic language vastly undermines or underplays the reality of Eric's sexual assault, suggesting that he doesn't see it as that serious, and vastly obscures the long-term consequences of his actions. Eva Smith becoming pregnant, and him being unable to take care of her unborn child. Moreover, the reference to a chap is deliberately broad and vague, seeming to include all men, which may highlight the normalization of such misogyny and sexual abuse amongst Edwardian society, as even upper class figures, respectable figures, even as Alderman Megati, like Alderman Megati, are deemed to engage in such behavior with little consequence. It is only the inspector who calls out this abhorrent behavior, saying, "You used her as if she was an animal, a thing." So Priestley the inspector acts as a mouthpiece for Priestley's morality as he calls out the objectification and dehumanization of women, as this simile highlights the unacceptable cruelty that men such as Eric feel is acceptable. Well, I might say due to the entitlement that men felt in Edwardian society. So a little bit of context there, how he's calling that out, that kind of behavior in Edwardian society. So what we're going to do now is a final paragraph, main body, where we talk about the end of the play. And we're going to look at Sheila's character. So we could say, however, by the end of the play, Priestley suggests that younger women, in particular, are becoming more independent and influential in society. And as Sheila is still reeling from the inspector's revelations about Gerald and her family, she rejects Gerald's offer of the marriage, stating that she needs time to think. So this develops Sheila's character as an independent thinker and someone who wants to make the correct decision for themselves, regardless of outside pressure from family or from society to get married as a woman. It dramatically juxtaposes her characterization early in the text as the audience now witnesses profound maturity and burgeoning, which means growing as well, adulthood. Sheila recognizes that she cannot rely on her family or fiance for moral guidance. Family, fiance, or society for moral guidance, and must take responsibility herself. Moreover, Sheila actually emerges as the character with the most moral conviction. With the most moral conviction out of her family. Indeed, the roles reverse as she calls out her parents for unacceptable behavior, saying, "You don't seem to have learnt anything." Like a parent, she is exasperated and frustrated with their shocking inability to take responsibility for their actions, in stark contrast to herself, as she immediately recognized the consequences, the folly of her actions, and refused to allow it to happen again. Let's link to context. What is Priestley reflecting? Again, it's this growing influence of women, both politically and in society, after the wars, as they had more freedom and they contributed in these wars, so they were now considered more equal citizens. So, as such, Priestley is reflecting the growing independence of women, both in political and societal spheres, as women, as they had made significant contributions to the war efforts and were moving towards equal citizenship due to the heroic actions of the suffragettes and other political activists. So that's my main body there. We've covered the beginning, middle, and end. If you have time, do a little conclusion where really you're just going to summarize what your points were again in different words and touch on the context again. What is Priestley's intention or message about this question? So we could say, in conclusion, presents life for women as very limited and restricted in society across class. Yet particularly for working class women who face vulnerability to exploitation and abuse. Vulnerable working class women like Eva Smith, who face vulnerabilities to exploitation and abuse. However, he reflects the progressive trends in society amongst women, particularly the younger generation in the post-war era, as he he believes in potential for future for transformation in women's role, as he believes in the potential of a transformation in women's role in society, following on from landmark victories such as the gaining of the vote for women and increasing participation in the workforce during the wars. So there you go, guys. That would be a really strong essay, clear thesis statement and introduction, which sets out your view of this question and links to Priestley's intention and the context. Now, each paragraph is exploring different elements. It's not repeating itself. It's covering the beginning, middle, and end. And it's varied in the techniques that I find, and I've varied my analysis. I haven't repeated myself. Key thing, I've covered beginning, middle, and end, and it's always related to that question. I've also brought in lots of nice context. The misogyny in Edwardian society that Priestley criticizes, as well as the potential for future independence that he's also putting forward. And in conclusion, just summarizes the points and links back to his intention about that theme. So in that sense, it would be a very strong level 6 essay, which is the top band essay. So stay tuned, guys. Tomorrow I'll be dropping the poetry question. So stay tuned, guys. Tomorrow I'll be dropping the exam technique for the poetry question.